Welcome to The View on GU, the place to be for translating uro-oncology knowledge to action. Here are your hosts, Drs. Aly-Khan Lalani and Christopher Wallis.
Hello and welcome to The View on GU. I'm Chris Wallis along with my co-host Aly-Khan Lalani, and we're back for 2026. Aly-Khan, last time we chatted, you were getting ready to head south. How were the holidays?
Mine was good. We survived. Nowhere near Venezuela, so that was okay. Could get back, and yeah, nice to have some time in the sun. And it really makes you wonder. We were talking off camera, getting off the plane and seeing the skies here. So not regretting being away, and now we're back at it in January in Ontario.
Absolutely. It's, lots to come, lots of work to be done, and I'm really happy that we're starting off the new year joined by Neil Fleshner. Normally we jump straight into the content, but today I want to take a little moment for introduction. Neil is, I think, known by almost everyone in urology and geo-oncology, not just in Canada, but probably worldwide. For me, this is, a real treat. Neil is a large part of why I pursued academic urology, and even more than that, a larger part of how I ended up back in Toronto following fellowship. And so, your example has been a huge part of how I've shaped my career and really influenced how I got to where I am. And so I think it's really interesting for me now to hear how you got from a career that maybe looks like a more successful version of what I've got so far to the new steps you've taken in the last maybe 5 or 10 years. And I think that's what we want to dive in today, that step beyond the standard academic or clinical practice into arguably greater contributions to society and taking things beyond just a day-to-day clinic. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, gentlemen. And Chris, those are kind words. And, you did the work, I promise you. So congratulations to you.
Oh, I appreciate it. So Neil, maybe to help us frame this, the context here is really to look at your efforts and your endeavors that have moved into entrepreneurial world, developing new molecules, bringing things to market, and allowing treatments to get to patients. And as we try to think of that as our end goal, can you give us a little bit of background how you get from being, a urology resident, doing an SUO fellowship, starting off building an academic and clinical practice? How do you migrate from that sort of world that I think a lot of people feel like they know and understand to a world that I think seems quite foreign to a lot of physicians?
Right. I mean, I wish I could write a real textbook or a how-to manual. I'm not sure I can, but I'll give you some background. First of all, I think from my personal point of view, I really think Canada is a great environ, if you will, or geographic place for one to spread your wings outside a traditional academic type of world. For one simple reason, we are not and remain not employees of our hospital. So we all have a degree of freedom as clinicians that perhaps, certainly those in the States, for example, wouldn't have. That's number one. Number two, I think the answer, there's no great master plan. This all sort of happened by accident, largely born out of frustration. So if we take the step back, I think that when I was very blessed to hold large positions in this city academically at a young age. I was still in my 30s when I was named chief at the General at UHN. I was in my 40s as chairman. And then I'm asking myself, and of course we all have 10-year terms, so I'm asking myself in my mid 50s, 54, 55, like, what's my next gig? Do I want to take another chair job and be a urologist, say, down the States? Or what's going to be my next gig? So that was part of it, looking for a new venue for my creativity. And the other was frankly born out of frustration. So, and I'll back up one other piece. When I built my divisions, when I started at the General as chief, there was one 0.6 research person. And when I finished, we had a group of about 40. We had large biobanks. We had expanded our footprint as a urology group tremendously. And in retrospect, even though I didn't know it then, I used an entrepreneurial model to build it. It wasn't for making money, but it's still entrepreneurial comes from the word or vice versa, enterprise. So I was building a large enterprise of biospecimens, of clinical trials, of massive clinical research teams. And it was basically building a business, whether you want to call it that, except the goal was not to make money. The goal was just to make the world a better place academically. And I think I use an entrepreneurial because I was trying to raise funds I used to joke that if I'd walk the floor of like the CUA, like all the pharma company managers would flee like a cat with mice, because I was always hitting them up for money, again, for a good cause, and also always trying to build, and never liked having a cut. And I think if you have that sort of spirit, in retrospect, so it's all about building. And for me to this day, what I like the most is getting a novel idea and seeing it through to fruition, whether it's a new program in biospecimens, whether it's a molecule, whether it's even a little tiny project with a med student. You get a new idea and you bring this through. To me, it's like one of the most rewarding things to do. My journey as an entrepreneur really came initially through the BCG shortage. So here I was ostensibly practicing at, I just saw it yesterday on the news, with the third or fourth best hospital in the world. And we have to start rationing BCG for our bladder cancer patients. And it got to the point where I think we were down to 1/10 of a dose. So we tried and take a vial and split it, 0.1, so we could treat 10 patients with one vial. The actual literature supporting that was kind of weak. And I said, this is crazy. I said, we should just bring in our own BCG to Canada. And I hooked up with a partner and found it as a chap who had known in the industry for years. And we formed a little company called Verity Pharmaceuticals, still exists, Canada, US, Puerto Rico. And our goal was to bring a novel BCG to solve the problem of BCG for Canadians. And a lot of stops and starts, great entrepreneurial stories of like success and triumphs. I mean, I'll just give you a quick little vignette. We had a deal inked with a company in Germany to bring BCG to Canada. And the deal had to be, it's called an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. It gets inked to a contract like in 30 days. And like day 28, they tell us, sorry, we're out. We're not selling you the BCG because we got an offer for all of our drugs in Canada. We have to roll BCG into it. And they bailed on us, right? And I remember the next day, we basically jumped on a plane to India and went to see the knock on the door at the Serum Institute of India. And that's how we got Verity BCG to Canada, solved the problem. And now it's about a 50-50 market. And it's funny because I'm actually giving a talk in a few weeks about this, but talk about impact. I was thinking about how many bladders I've saved or recurrences I've saved in Canada in a different kind of way, right? As opposed to a one-on-one with every patient. But in this case, it would be through giving, in some cases, life-saving or bladder-saving treatments. And of course, once that started, like a business got started, right? So we got a partner, we got capital, we raised money just to go ask friends and family, can you want to invest 25,000, 50,000? I mean, that's how it happened. And that company to this day now has about 80 employees, Canada, US, Puerto Rico. We do probably like almost $80 million a year in sales, and it goes. And it's morphed into a more urology company. But that's how it all happened. And then around the same time, my curiosity, which was also one of my sort of traits, got very interested in what I was hearing was going on in Germany with lutetium-based PSMA therapy. And I had a couple of high net worth patients who were dying of advanced prostate cancer, post-chemo, post-ARPI. I said, listen, I've heard about this great stuff going on. If you want, I'm happy to be your personal physician. Let's go. And I escorted 2 men. This was in January 2019 to Germany, to Berlin. And they admitted them in those days. I think they still do there. And what happened is when they were admitted, I was just learning about all this stuff. And of course, I came home, I was impressed because my origins were all academic. I went to the head of the cancer center and I said, we got to start a lutetium PSMA program here. And actually, one of those men had given me $1 million kickstart. And I started to get the gears a bit. No, we had a bit of a lutetium dotatate program at the time. Let's wait for that. About 3-4 meetings, and I was getting nowhere. And it's not like I hadn't built big programs in the hospital, but I was getting frustrated that I wasn't moving anywhere. And then, of course, at one point they said, maybe this is not for surgery. Maybe it's like one of the other specialties should do it, which is like putting a red flag in front of this bull. So after a bit of frustration, I then went to a board meeting from company A and say, hey guys, I just got back from Germany. Let me show you some photos. Do you think there's anything we could do here? Maybe. And also as part of trying to get the program going here, I called around to say, who's going to make the drug for us? And it turned out, even though Canadian patients were not benefiting from these drugs, one of the world leading manufacturers and distributors of this was actually at your house, was a non-for-profit shop on the campus of McMaster University, the Center for Probe Development and Commercialization. And their CEO, a chap called Joe McCann, called him up. I said, "Can you supply us?" He said, "Yeah, we could do it." And after I got the frustration call, I called him up. I said, "Let's go have dinner." And Point Biopharma was born that night, along with a third partner who was a good money person, because I wouldn't know much about that, a great friend. And next thing you know, COVID hits. We went to buy molecules in Germany. COVID hits. And through COVID, 6 months later, we have like 30 employees. A year later, we have 200 employees. We went public in July of 2022, and then sold to Lilly the end of December 23 for $1.4 billion US. So this thing just went crazy.
I mean, that's amazing. Like, I think one question and we're 10 minutes in. I think that's such an amazing answer. And I've heard a lot of key terms there. The curiosity, which you needed. You saw frustration, but you went around that. You ultimately wanted impact. And that entrepreneurial spirit was even there in academia. It didn't just get born in opening up a business. So I want to come back and pull on that thread a little bit later about where that came from within you, neural wiring, the behavioral piece of it. But maybe for our listeners and viewers, they'll be very curious as to how your experience is now. You've talked a bit about Point, the genesis. Can you take us through that acquisition, but also what your life is or was like in that CMO and in that role, and then how that day-to-day felt like as a surgeon?
It was always a struggle, but I also was blessed by luck. The luck was COVID, and I'll tell you why. Our first meeting as a company was January 8th, 2020. COVID broke out sort of March, and we started raising money. And of course, you always need good luck in some of these stories. There was a lot of money being thrown at healthcare during COVID from the street, from the investment community. Secondly, we were able to raise funds virtually. So just to see, like, if you go on a roadshow to raise money for a company, you fly to New York, arrive there at 8 a.m., maybe have a 9 a.m. meeting, travel time between each house probably at an hour, and maybe with a lunch you get 4 face-to-face raises. During COVID, first of all, we were barely operating, so I had time. I could duck out of a virtual clinic if I had to for an hour and raise funds. So I was really sort of juggling those two, but the juggle was not as hard as it sounds, because COVID really provided a huge gap in my schedule that allowed us to do that. And I would always time my calls to know when it was going to be in between cases or before a case, or when a case would be over. And we were able to pull it off. I would say 85% of my fundraising calls, I was wearing surgical scrubs.
And so that was the COVID. That's how funds got raised. And then beyond the fundraising, just actioning, being in your role and balancing that clinical practice. What was that like? I mean, the travel from academia must have been significant at that time with your productivity, and then you're balancing this growing thing. You've gotten multiple cycles of funding. So what was that kind of day-to-day like?
Chaotic. I mean, but really exhilarating. I think one of the greatest things about being an academic MD, especially surgeon, I don't know about your experience, is I sometimes have one of the most interesting days in the world. Why? Because I could spend 3 hours looking after patients, an hour with my research group, an hour looking at some administrative problem. And this just added on an hour or two of basically work as a CMO. We hired a great team. We had a great person from our medical team, a woman called Jessica Jensen, excellent person. We worked really closely together. And of course, I never was a CMO before, right? So I was learning as well. But, between it all, it just kind of all worked. We wrote our splash protocol. We had to get it through. We went through FDA, lots of hiccups up and down. We bought new molecules. We had a dotatate program and we had an FAP program. So it was fantastically interesting to learn to speak a new language a little bit later in your career, as opposed to, like, I never want to be one of these surgeons hanging out, in the surgeon's lounge at age 80, talking about the good old days in the operating room. It's a really eloquent way, I think, to cap my career as well.
I feel like that curiosity blending with the initial frustration or barrier you're trying to overcome. And I feel like you've operationalized that in arguably one of the most productive ways possible. And I feel like when we take a step back, every clinician has their day-to-day frustrations. When I think about, the clinical trial or the research environment, often that's the genesis for a research idea is, maybe uncertainty or variation in practice or something like that. And so for you in the entrepreneurial world, it was not that variation, it was a barrier or a lack of access. But you've talked a lot about the need for teams to help you take that frustration or that curiosity into actual action. So how do you, as someone, coming out of an academic or clinical world, navigate building that team around you? And what does that process look like?
Well, the process is, ask yourself is all right, what are the components of a successful enterprise? What can I fill and what can I not fill? And I think one of the biggest mistakes, particularly medical entrepreneurs make, is they all want to be CEOs. I don't know if it's an ego thing, but I could tell you one of the biggest red flags for me to invest in a company, because I do a lot of investments now, is if the inventor owner is also the CEO, it's kind of, I'm out. I'm not in, because it's a different skill set that we have. I can't be a CEO. It's not what I want to do. It's not my mojo. I think you need somebody who understands operations and you need somebody who understands money, and then combine that with a scientific and a clinical vision, which is sort of what I had. And I think our three founders who I mentioned all would agree that if we didn't have the other two, this never would have happened. Like a true triumvirate, if you will, of complementary talent. And I think if it was either one of us, it wouldn't have worked.
Yeah. I love what you said about that dyad model. You need the operational finances and someone in that medical scientific lead. I think that's how even in academia, the best clinical trial enterprises will be run. But I also loved, you made a comment that I think private equity does. When you see the owner being the CEO or their founder being CEO, private equity will change that. Board seats, everything will shift once you acquire. So I love that you've gone there with that. So let's get into a little bit, if you can share, was this born? Is this something, this entrepreneurial spirit, which clearly predated the Verity and Point? I mean, is this something that you could take from young age? Is this learned from parents? Is this something kind of lineage you've seen in your history? Where did that come from?
It's a good question. Listen, I do come from a family of entrepreneurs. My mother was a very successful entrepreneur. She was divorced and bankrupt at sort of in her early 30s and with 3 young kids, and started an enterprise in retail, and eventually had about 20 shops in the Montreal area. So there was a lot of talk around business in our home, I would say. Mostly customer service more than anything, which I also think is important. And Chris will remember this, but I always bark to the residents, right? It's not the privilege for the patient to see you. It's the other way around, right? That's a customer model. So I guess that was around me, but I never thought I had those skills in a very overt way. Never went to business school, never interested me, like to have a nice living like everybody, but never thought that this kind of would happen. Bizarre.
It's interesting because, so many of us encounter the same things that you describe as the nidus of your experience, right? Those same frustrations or barriers. And yet I think many of us tolerate the frustration. I guess maybe this is my theory and I'm projecting on you, but what's the difference between, not accepting that no as an answer and taking it and finding a way around the no or around the barrier?
Yeah, I think stubbornness. I hate to be told I can't do something. It hits some deep part of my brain and frustrates me and angers me sometimes. And I think I've always been very creative. Again, even when I was a chair and when I was chief, at finding third solutions to problems. There was A or B, and I was pretty good, and still am pretty good about thinking of a C solution that's a bit outside the box. I don't like being told no if I believe in something. And I think most people will accept the frustration, just throw up their shoulders and say, oh, well, that's just the way it is. But I think if you really want to have impact, you got to sometimes just act and put a plan in place and see if you can fix it a different way.
Part of that, A, B, and getting to C instead, or not accepting no, is excellent. Clearly, it's been a key. These are key elements of your career. But at some point, whether it's in a meeting, making a decision, you've also found a way to say, okay, I think we got to sell on this idea, or I think we got to pivot away. And we've held this belief, but we need to kind of transition that alternate path. So how have you developed, and this doesn't need to be business, we can open this up, but how did you also say, look, I don't want to say no, I want to go there, but then say, okay, I've kind of seen the light and we need to move. Like, how do you balance that? Because I assume for a lot of young trainees, that will be a key metric of their success in whatever they do, is saying, hey, you got to have the dogged determination. You got to be able to look for answer C when people are presenting just A and B. But you also need to find a way to say, you know what, I think we hold our cards, or we kind of sell and move on. Like, how do you decide cutting bait and keeping going?
I don't know if I'm good at cutting bait, to be frank. I think, although I've gone better as I've got older about which battles are worth fighting, I think that comes with experience as an administrator more than anything. But also, just from an oomph point of view, I think as you get older, you don't have the oomph. But sometimes you do have to pivot, I think. But if you believe in what you're doing, you really don't. Anyways, there's countless examples I could tell you when I was chief where, we just thought about ways to solve problems, whether it was like getting a recruit or whether it was, I just think about so many examples. Because you deal with personalities a lot, right? HR is also one of the hardest, obviously, parts, is managing people through all of this, which is also, I think, a skill. No one's teaching this in med school, right?
Totally agree. That behavioral science of walking into whatever room it is, galvanizing a team towards ideas, pitching, recruiting funds, selling, hiring, firing. I mean, it's behavioral science. And I think we don't get taught that. Forget the whole basic business and money in medicine. But I agree with you on that. Maybe last one for me, because we could keep going. And this has been an awesome conversation. You have, one of them has been here, a lot of trainees and a lot of tree of people around you. And maybe they're listening to this thinking a little bit about entrepreneurial spirit, but also just navigating issues as they raise. Any pearls or tips for people thinking maybe about entrepreneurship in medicine? What would be some pearls you might, share with those folks?
First thing I would say is don't try and do it alone. Find people. Most people don't know what a Series A is, right? I didn't know it 15 years ago. Find people who know what they're doing in terms of getting companies started and operating. Secondly, and that's why I think you can focus on the science, which is sort of what I did. And then that's number one. And number two is expect to fail maybe once or twice. Don't give up. I had one venture that didn't go very well prior in the equipment business. So it's not like, most entrepreneurs will tell you it's not the first time. Well, you have to have a belief. You have to keep trying. I think that's another one of them. And there's I hate to say it, there's a big luck factor. We joke. I remember when we had a closing dinner when we went public, one of my partners said, I'll tell you, there was about 3 or 4 times that the whole thing could have crumbled. And we pulled an ace of spades out of the deck every single time.
Very interesting. We're almost done. I want one maybe clue into your mindset here. And I think we're going to contrast the two companies. It's a different version of how do you know when to finish. But Verity has not been sold. You sold Point. How do you decide or know when you've taken something to your reach and then you hand it off to someone else versus is this something that you want to own? And I think for entrepreneurs starting with small ideas, there's that notion of, how much do I develop this myself versus how much do you sell the idea forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what your end game is. I think Point was a true drug development company. So revenue is far away. So all that you want to build there. So basically the industry is set up to be taken out if you're in that by a big or medium-sized pharmaceutical company. That's how it's all set up. So that's almost a goal when you start it. The flip side is Verity, because it's sort of more of an old school pharma company, bringing in drugs and selling them, actually has cash flow. And, is a great, so it could, when I'm long gone and retired, it can give me dividend checks when I'm done. But, who's to say if the right, a big pharma would never buy that business. That may be a private equity group that just wants to buy cash flow. So they're very different from that point of view. But I think most medical entrepreneurs would probably be in the former, more like a point type model. And, again, you don't want to be running a business as a doctor. The only other thing I would say is my story is maybe a little bit more atypical. Again, when you read about great entrepreneurs, they have a belief in their mission and they give it all up. They quit their day jobs. They're eating tuna fish out of a can for 6 years. I never did that. I always held on to medicine as my safety net and did it sort of as a side hustle and continued to in a way. And now medicine is just a great human thing for me. And that's why I continue to do it, because I love the humanity of it. Not because I need to financially, and it's still great. And I still love doing small research projects with a student in med school who wants to be a baby urologist.
And that's good. That's the light, the spark, right? That we've all, I think, probably been privileged to have to keep doing what we're doing. Neil, we could go on and on. So thank you so much for doing this.
Hey, pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
We ideally wanted to do this in the warmer confines of Florida, but we
That
did it here.
better.
We'll maybe have to do it again. And so again, thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of my co-host, Chris Wallis, I'm Aly-Khan Lalani. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. We'd love to hear about other topics you want to hear about. More to come this year. And shortly after you hear this episode, we will be at San Francisco, summarizing all the latest and greatest from GU ASCO. So again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again shortly.